There are often games that'll come around that are show stealers, a must play, and innovate the formula in a new way, shape, or form, borrowing influences from many different aspects of previous games and melding them together to make an experience that is unique and stands out from many other contemporaries. Stellar Blade is a game that really excited and delighted me when I saw the influences that it pulls from, as well as the setting, flair, and everything that really embodied those promotionals and even the demo. Upon release, it is a game that I have had to sit here and really think about for a good few weeks after finishing it, because Stellar Blade is an incredibly interesting topic of discussion for many different reasons. Firstly, it is the combat that you uniquely categorized as this hybrid between the Souls-like elements that it has that really lay out its progression and the way that you evolve Eve and also take place in the combat itself, but also its flow of combat, which feels more akin to a hack and slash game. The second is this loud conversation around Eve's assets, which won't be a focal point of this topic. However, one thing that is a focal point of this review is Stellar Blade's narrative, and where it pretty blatantly takes clear influences from, which is the masterful Nier Automata. But honestly, it is my belief Stellar Blade is the most Platinum Games video game that is not made by Platinum that I've experienced in a long time. This is largely attributed to the wealth of character, style, and energetic nature that Stellar Blade has coursing in its DNA. But conversely, this sense of personality feels almost lost or bipolar when it comes to this sense of storytelling that Stellar Blade tries to invoke, pulling from this more emotional and existential narrative that really clearly borrows from something like Nier Automata without really having earned it. And like what I mean by that is that when I feel like I'm playing Stellar Blade, I feel like I'm playing a game more closer to Metal Gear Revengeance than I am Nier Automata. They're both Platinum games, but they are very different in their thematics, and I feel like Stellar Blade really is at its best when it is invoking that sense of that energetic, quirky like nature that the game does try to really tap into sometimes. And I think Stellar Blade does do a good job at telling some independent stories here, but at other times it feels like it's trying to really do something and be something it's not. And that identity crisis is one of the more weaker aspects of Stellar Blade's narrative that holds back an otherwise really fun and engaging experience. So you're probably wondering at this point, Tamu, do you even like this game? Hell yeah I do, man. I love this game. I really did like Stellar Blade a lot, because this game, whilst it doesn't embody the emotional heights of Nier Automata narratively, is an experience that effortlessly nails the high-octane action that resembles all the other works of a studio like Platinum Games, but is so distinctive in its own right and carves out its own path for which I hope is a returning series. And based on the recent information that we're getting and what Shift Up is wanting to do, it looks like that may be the case, and I'm all the more excited. So with all that in mind, I want to lead into this review with this statement in mind. Your enjoyment of Stellar Blade will ride on how much you can click with its combat first and foremost, followed by its exploration and progression. If you're here looking for that spiritual successor to its influences, narratively, you are going to be disappointed, because I think Stellar Blade is a downright fun game and an action-packed adventure that really does jump to some insane highs that can be this embodiment of Sekiro meets Metal Gear Rising, but at the same time, it doesn't really deliver on and match up to the game that it's so clearly trying to be narratively. And I think when Stellar Blade gets into being its own thing and finding its own identity, it'll be a better game for it. So with all that in mind, let's get into my review of Stellar Blade. So I want to kick this review off with the biggest elephant in the room, and that is Stellar Blade's story. So the story for Stellar Blade sees you play as Eve, who has been dispatched by Mother Sphere to depart on a mission to Earth to take it back from the epidemic force known as the Natibas. Through the assistance of her companions Adam and Lily, Eve sets out on a journey to stop the strong entities called Alpha Natibas and collect a power source called hypercells to help repower the main city of the last remaining shred of civilization known as Zion, which acts as the game's central hub. The game throws many twists and turns as well as attempts at trying to get you invested in the main cast, but here's where the story in a lot of ways really does fall apart for me. The game establishes these moments that are supposed to feel compelling or supposed to be a revelation, but it never really gives you a reason to connect or get invested with many of the particular plot points or the characters. This for me left many of those impactful moments feeling a lot less significant or unearned than I would have liked them to be. And I guess you could say to me, well, the story isn't the forefront of this and it's not trying to take itself seriously, or it's not the main focus of the game. And it's like, but it is trying to take itself seriously. It is very much trying to take itself seriously a lot of the time with these story moments, and that's the problem. I feel like there isn't a proper sense of pacing there to really get you invested in a lot of these side characters. I'd say there's like lighthearted moments with Lily and Adam, but you don't really get to learn a whole heap about them through the main story. And I feel like whilst you do get information, there isn't enough there to really build this strong relationship outside of some stiff dialogue and some conversations that feel kind of tacked in there. It's quite clear here when looking at the cliff notes of Stellar Blade's story that it took a large amount of influence from Nier Automata's narrative and chose to create a world of in a bleak setting, and it's this tonally very similar game that goes skin deep in terms of the themes that made Nier so special. And Stellar Blade doesn't need to copy Nier, it can do its own thing, but even in terms of what it does, outside of that very skeletal and two like forces of nature fighting each other, there isn't really anything else there to really pick apart. And I think that the later half of Stellar Blade is when things really start to get interesting, because that's kind of when it deviates and starts to find its own little identity outside of what has been established or what it's trying to pull influence from. And this is where I feel the biggest difference is. Nier Automata is like an onion with many layers that you peel through, with sequential playthroughs and these 3 main playthroughs having changed perspectives and revealing different information that slowly unravels to the climax of the story. Stellar Blade's story feels like it takes a lot of those ideas, but it struggles to clearly communicate, set the stage, and build on these ideas early on, not to mention the relationships of these key characters. It feels structurally that Stellar Blade has these big moments listed down, but it lacks the character development, world building, and overall tonal setting to provide the payoff and impact for these moments when they ultimately happen. Take for example in the demo or early on in the story, minor spoilers, so click away if you're wanting to avoid everything. There's a scene where you are like dispatched with another teammate, Taki, and she's supposed to like be this character that means something to Eve, but ultimately when she's killed off, like, I don't know, me personally, I didn't really feel anything for that moment. And later on, when there's some twists and turns involving that character, I still didn't really feel anything because that character was barely given any time to really mean anything to begin with. And I feel it's these type of moments that feel like they come across more cheap than meaningful. And I think that had Stellar Blade focused on more fleshing out these types of characters, the setting, and it does dive into some of these themes and ideas later on, but had it really established this and tried to explore these things early before peeling back its own onion, really it could have benefited a lot from that and told a much more meaningful and emotional story. I seriously do believe that Stellar Blade is narratively at its best when it is trying to deviate from its influences rather than emulate them. And what I hope to see with this eventual sequel is the story that further tries to find its own identity, because I do think that there is a lot of foundational ideas here in Stellar Blade and a lot of things that they've established that can work, but the way that they've laid them out and the way they convey them and feed them to the player doesn't really give you a way to get invested or really care. And it feels like it's stuck in the shadow of its influences more than defining its own identity. And I really do hope that it doubles down on some of the stuff that we've seen later on in the game and really does tell and flesh out that story a lot more going forward. Now, I'd like to get into one of the major standouts for Stellar Blade, and that is its combat, and how it blends 2 different worlds of combat together. This methodical parrying and countering system that is more alike the likes of something like Sekiro, melded with this burst skills and beta skills that feel more like combo chaining that can be found in something like a hack and slash game. It provides this level of maneuverability but has a base set of fundamental skills and functions. The combat is really interesting and it inherits a lot of the staples of a Souls-like game, with parry mechanics found in something like Sekiro, counter systems like Sekiro, but at the same time it feels a lot less punishing, with enemies resetting upon death but sometimes having some of their health remain, or no currency that is lost upon death. The boss encounters for the most part are fairly manageable too, with 1 or 2 at the end that'll really test your understanding of both the parry system, the dashes, and how to counter enemy attacks. If there is one thing that I can commend Stellar Blade for, it is the amount of enemy variety and the new essential kit of abilities that are incorporated on top of the progression systems, which feel like they are fitting for the purpose to approach different enemies in different ways. Whether it's using a particular ability to break the shield of a foe, or alternatively being able to interrupt an enemy's combos with well-timed abilities. There is also these different abilities that you'll acquire later on in the game called burst attacks, which are your big damage abilities. and they are a lot of fun. The little tricks that you can use here in Stellar Blade as well to your advantage, like one ability when casted gives you invulnerability whilst performing that attack. There is a level of understanding when to use and time your abilities properly and get the upper hand on different enemies, but it also feels like the game levels up with you too, introducing enemies and bosses that'll catch you out if you aren't progressing with it. For those who are familiar with the Souls-likes, particularly Sekiro, as I've mentioned earlier, and have called heavy reference to this intentionally, Stellar Blade will land somewhere on the easier side, but I do believe that its combat is a welcoming vibe check for anyone on the fence about the genre. It really does call into question a lot of those more timed, methodical types of abilities to counter and dodge enemy attacks, but it also has a bit more of a friendly maneuverability with having abilities that are more based around moves and combos and abilities that lend itself to more or less a hack and slash, for lack of the better words, without the intensive combos that are found with those games. Its abilities come in a set of 4, and the best way I could probably describe it if I'm comparing it to a hack and slash is a game more like Final Fantasy 16 than something the likes of Bayonetta. Overall, I do think Stellar Blade provides a good amount of kits and abilities that make combat feel refreshing, fun, and feel like it's evolving throughout its playthrough with multiple different modes and movesets that can come with you, but like nothing too crazy like button mashy combos, and on the Souls front, nothing too insane that feels like it is on the likes of a FromSoft game by any means. It takes out a lot of the more punishing aspects of those systems while still ascertaining the things like the bonfire system and enemies resetting upon death. But we'll get more into that in the next component, which is the exploration for Stellar Blade, which is comprised of many different facets that flesh out the game's level design. There are some open areas to explore that have some side quests and the usual stuff you'd expect, but there are more linear levels here that do have open paths as well that you can explore that usually do lead to different loot, which can feed into the progression for Stellar Blade, which we'll tackle shortly. The side paths for the more linear levels are accompanied by platforming segments which do break up the exploration, although they can feel a little finicky at times, the platforming. Overall, I thought it was pretty fun, and it does provide a level of verticality and some extra little rewards for going off to the side. And there's also some data logs that do explain a bit more about the world too, which I do find most of the time were fairly interesting. There are also these infamous open world towers that appear in the open areas of the game, which power on the camps for this particular zone, making them an essential stop-off point, as your camps are where you'll recharge your health, upgrade your abilities, and everything of that nature, similar to how the bonfires work in any other Souls game. They are also often accompanied by a decent puzzle and often a nice boss encounter to get these towers up and running, and I think that it's a nice way to make these towers feel very distinct and different, but they ultimately will serve the same purpose that you found in many other games. The side quests in these open world areas, they take place in between the story, and sometimes they're good, and most of the time they can be really hit or miss. There are some here that feel decent and do provide a nice backdrop to the world of Stellar Blade, but there are some that feel like they're a laundry list of things to do or collect. Speaking of things to collect, there is one neat addition that can be found in the game, and I think it's quite quirky and charming, and there's these collectible soda cans and the different poses Eve makes when collecting them too. These collectibles, whilst nothing new in the video games, are a nice little moment of levity that comes, and I think it's great. I do think it's a nice addition, and it does come with its own set of little upgrades and rewards as well through something that I won't spoil. But I think that this is the type of stuff that I'm talking about, where I say when Stellar Blade finds its own little charm, it really does distinguish itself quite well. Last but not least, these campfires, the ones that I mentioned earlier, they will be scattered across each locale of the game, both the linear levels and the more open areas. These campfires serve as a hub and a spawn point for Eve, as I mentioned, much like how the bonfires operate in a Souls game. They are where you will purchase consumables and interface with the progression systems. Again, this camp will, when resting at it, respawn all the enemies, but death will not forfeit any currency or experience, making Stellar Blade a much less punishing game, and its levels are structured like a Souls game without the punishing systems of one, which might be something that will appeal to some or might take away the challenge for others. But for me, given all the other things that Stellar Blade has going on, that really didn't take away much from the experience for me personally. Next up, we're going to talk about the progression for Stellar Blade, which I feel can be sliced into many different segments, which independently might seem familiar or like something you've seen before, but I would say collectively they make up a satisfying whole. The primary form of progression in Stellar Blade derives itself from the core progression that can be found in any Souls-like experience. You'll be granted a currency for defeating enemies. And Stellar Blade takes a similar approach to games like Jedi Survivor, having this currency accumulate to provide the player with a skill point once they've accumulated a certain amount, which can be used to upgrade Eve's various abilities. These abilities are upgraded through a skill tree and multiple skill trees that have a level of breadth that can branch out to the 4 main abilities that she'll use. And whilst they don't provide combos or anything like that, they do offer things such as a more generous window for parrying and follow-up attacks and things of that nature. And they do help further double down on the existing abilities. And in a way, I kind of do like this, because in some senses, I do feel like less is more, but I do feel like they tighten up the experience on those abilities and make you play around with and want to progress with the existing core set of abilities, making it fun to use those different beta skills and later on those burst skills. And there is a lot of different abilities there. It'll look like a massive tree, but I think in terms of what it offers, it is a little steady, and like some, I think, of these abilities can feel a little bit more worthwhile than others, and some trees I think can leave a bit to be desired. Overall, it isn't the craziest progression tree that you'll ever see, but I think that it does provide a level of skill upgrades that I think do help with the core fundamental combat. But the next form of progression is where you can start to play around a bit, and that is with these sockets. So sockets are unlocked throughout your playthrough, which provide various different forms of stat bonuses, improving parry times, critical damage, or time it takes to have beta skills charge. And overall, it feeds into the rewards economy for Stellar Blade's exploration, incentivizing you to go off the beaten path. The game does feel like it's rewarding you often, however, I feel like the materials and items collected don't have a sense of structure as to how important they are. It makes upgrading and the collection of these materials feel like an afterthought, as you are opening stuff throughout your playthrough, but never actually feel like you're on the lookout for something particular to enhance or benefit you directly. Instead, what you're rewarded with feels arbitrary. The main items that feel rewarding are more collectibles, and these come in the form of these cores that can be found on dead bodies, which upgrade your health, your beta skills, or weapon level. These feel like actual substantial upgrades that do get a permanent reward from your exploration. However, outside of this, it feels like many of the other forms of rewards and items collected feel like something you more or less glaze over, and I only ever think about it when I'm upgrading these sockets later on, which brings me to my next point. I overall enjoyed the concept of Stellar Blade and its sockets, and I think they are a good addition, but I feel like it left a lot to be desired with the terms of flexibility and overall build crafting. I feel like I wish these sockets would actually have switched up the playstyle to some extent. Maybe these sockets were the way that could provide me a different skill and have me focus on a different beta skill, and maybe mix and match and adjust my playstyle if I want to play more aggressively or more passively. And I feel like these sockets never really did anything outside of that, but they more doubled down on what the skill tree was already doing, with just tightening up the experience of the already existing skills. And like I said, sometimes less is better, and tightening those skills might incentivize a more strategic sense of play and working within this kit that is provided. It feels like there's a lot of different skill trees and systems here to progress the set of abilities that Eve can execute without really feeling like you're making anything meaningful outside of just seeing critical damage or parry windows and things like this go up. And don't get me wrong, those do help in battle, but it feels like there is something missed along the way. And it feels like most of the cohesion here comes from stat buffs more than substantial combat changes. And that brings me to the final component of progression, which I feel like does deliver in a sense on the key complaint of sockets, and that is exospines. You'll be able to equip 2 of these in your playthrough, and they do offer a level of flexibility to your playstyle, and they are another thing that you'll be rewarded with through exploration. Much like sockets, you're able to upgrade exospines, and with it, you will have added abilities that stack on top of the initial ability. I think that these exospines are a great starting point and blueprint for what Stellar Blade could eventually go on to incorporate and flesh out its combat model. And I get it, I understand why they're only stuck with these 4 abilities. And again, I think this is another example of Stellar Blade's identity crisis. It is trying to keep a very basic type of set of abilities that are easy to use, difficult to master type of approach. And then it's relying on things like parrying and countering and pulling itself and its influences very heavily in this department from the likes of things like Sekiro. And I get that, but I think at the same time it is trying to do something that is entirely different, with having moves and abilities that feel like something out of Final Fantasy 16, for example. And I think that these two things kind of clash in a way that I think you can have more abilities and you can have things to play around with that can still be easy in concept to use but difficult to master, and provide flexibility, work with the progression that Stellar Blade is clearly going for, while still having somewhat of that tight experience and that level of mastery, memorization, and things that come from boss encounters that you're pulling that influence from with things like Sekiro. So I hope with the future, Stellar Blade really does double down with its progression, because whilst it isn't bad, I definitely think that it is at a level of like, it's serviceable, but it definitely could be better. And I definitely think there is more here that they can pull from in future entries. Now onto the visuals and sound presentation for Stellar Blade, which is one area where Stellar Blade absolutely excels. The visuals are top notch and really do bring many of the various locales of Stellar Blade's world to life. From ruined cities to desert plains to the futuristic techie environments, Stellar Blade is always a gorgeous game to look at, and the different animations, particle effects, and over-the-top action only serve to bolster the game's visual fidelity and beauty. Not to mention the amount of enemy variety and unique designs for these various Nitibas that you'll face, alongside the various boss encounters too. I think that there is a good mixture here, and I think the Nitiba, in terms of the way they're presented as enemies, look insanely cool and interesting, and I do like the different types of enemies and how they do mesh into the game. But that also, I do like the way that many of these characters are designed. I mean, there's obvious reasons for like why people like Eve, but I think like many of the different outfits and suits that you get in this game, and the fact that you can collect many of them as well, it's awesome. And it's another collectible that I didn't really touch on in the progression segment, but I'll touch on here. I do feel like the cosmetics in Stellar Blade, like the nano suits, really do look mad, and they do provide a cool level of variation to how you want to customize and style your Eve. And it's great to know that many more of these are coming along the way. And they have provided many of these different cosmetic customizations, not just to Eve, but to her party members as well. Even her party members, Adam and Lily, also have their own set of customization too. And you can customize like things like the hair and glasses and outfits for all of these characters, and I think it's a nice addition as well. I think that there's tons of different unique features in this game that really do bring it to life. And I think the customization and cosmetics are a welcome one, and it's nice to know that many more of these will be on the way. And whilst the visual fidelity is awe-inspiring and jaw-dropping, the music doesn't hold up either, pulling any punches. It is a downright banger, and Stellar Blade's soundtrack is incredible, and honestly is the closest thing to feeling like Nier Automata that I feel like Stellar Blade nails. And that probably is in large part due to having Keiichi Okabe on the score for this one too. And the music in this game is just incredible. And also there is a lot of variety here with a lot of the different soundtracks, like pieces. There is the unique ambient electronic tracks that play, and I've mentioned throughout this video just how eclectic Stellar Blade is with where it pulls influence from, and it really can be seen even in the music variety. And man, it is just incredible. It is great to see in Stellar Blade as well, with many different areas, how they use dynamic soundtracks as well, when you're exploring the open world to when you just shift right into combat, and the way that the music will change to accompany those pieces of music and the fight or exploration. And I think it is great, and I love it when games do this, and I think Stellar Blade does an excellent job at doing that. There are even drowned out variations of the track that'll play when Eve is underwater too, and like I discovered that really early on in the game, and it was something I was like, man, this is really cool. And it really can just, you can really see in a lot of areas of presentation that Shift Up has put a ton of work into this game and really trying to make you feel a lot of the atmosphere of Stellar Blade. And in terms of that atmosphere, I think that is one aspect that I think Stellar Blade actually does a really good job at nailing. So I've been sitting here for a while pondering on how to really articulate this next part of the video, because I really do think it's an interesting one when I think about this game. I mean, obviously I've made this connection, and many others have too, about how Stellar Blade really does pull a lot of its core influences narratively from a game like Nier Automata. And I mean, even Shift Up's like team and creatives aren't afraid to admit this. And in many ways, I feel that Stellar Blade is an eclectic ensemble of what makes a Platinum game slap. And honestly, I mean that in the most complimentary way, because to me, Stellar Blade captures all the highlights of a Platinum game. And it's like, from its soundtrack sounding like Nier Automata to, but also a little bit like Astral Chain at times, whilst Eve's design oozing that Bayonetta energy. And whilst I say I can feel the energy of all these different games coming out in Stellar Blade, it definitely does feel like Shift Up here have blended their influence with these ideas and created a game that ultimately feels really distinct. And I mean, you can see it in many different areas, from the forgiving Souls-like elements to its overall energetic nature, and its trying to, but didn't really quite nail it for me, emotional story. Honestly, I really hope that this unique collective of energy that Shift Up have brought with Stellar Blade is something that they continue to double down on in the sequel, and they can kind of find their footing and deviate a bit from their influences, and whilst ascertaining and keeping a lot of what made that so special to begin with. And I think Stellar Blade, like I've said many times, really does excel when it embraces these wackier elements, and I do believe that there is a good narrative there to tell, and the concepts that they pull from aren't inherently bad, and I think they can work within the universe they've crafted. The hack and slash Souls-like elements is something that's super satisfying to play with too, and I do think that they do have a lot of different winning formulas on their hand here, and for their first outing really trying to make a AAA game on this scale, I think they've done an incredible job here, and I'm really just fascinated to see where they do go with Stellar Blade 2, because I do think that whilst in this video, even I have compared Stellar Blade to many different games and fantastic games, I do think that that is just a testament to Stellar Blade. Whilst its first entry may be in the shadow of the giants that it's trying to live up to, it is still an incredible feat to be in that conversation in the first place. And I think that Shift Up, if they continue with this trajectory and they make that Stellar Blade 2, really will have a winner here with their sequel. So bringing this whole video to a close, I think Stellar Blade is a fantastic first outing in the realm of the AAA video game for Shift Up. The combat is a blend that feels refreshing and addictive, with progression systems that, whilst can be built upon and further fleshed out upon, do service the core foundations really well and do offer a serviceable experience in terms of progression. It by no means is bad, and it is fun to tinker around with and play, and there is a level and element of build crafting there. Stellar Blade's story is one that has potential, and when it isn't trying to chase the highs of its influences, you can see clearly the potential and more broadly what this series can encompass in future entries. There are restraints that hold Stellar Blade back from soaring with the greats, but there is a game here and a universe that I think is really worth checking out, especially for those looking for a game with satisfying combat, visuals, and music. So to close this one off, I did really enjoy Stellar Blade, and I hope this video hasn't come across overly critical. It's just I enjoyed the game, and I can identify that there are some things that I just really do hope that they can continue to double down on in future entry, because I think Shift Up for a first attempt have made a great game here, and I think that given the chance to make another one, which they are already in talks of doing, I think they could really be onto a winning series here, one that is talked about for a long time. And yeah, I think Stellar Blade is definitely one worth checking out, and I'm all the more excited for when the eventual Stellar Blade 2 drops and any future content that comes for this entry. Anyways, that's my video, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and let me know what you think about Stellar Blade down below. And as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.